Now it's being recorded.
No, you didn't.
Okay, a reminder.
I'm gonna
Exam
say.
number 3 on Thursday. Exam number 3 will cover everything since exam number 2.
Oh, so not the exam 2, right?
Which includes the Renaissance and the manners today. So I hope you guys who chose not to come to class on Thursday will watch the video on the High Renaissance.
When?
Before Thursday.
Which Thursday?
So exam number 3 is going to be about exam number 2 and what we're going to talk about today.
Well, everything since exam 2.
No.
We've
Yeah,
only
not
done.
all
We've
of it.
only
Oh,
had,
it's
actually like-
after.
yeah, we've only had the Renaissance.
And then the last, or the third exam is shorter than the other ones, right?
Exactly. There are only 33 questions,
Oh, really?
but they're worth
Good,
3
they're way
points.
more.
So be sure you
Don't mess up.
review the old exam in preparation. Now, let me show you very quickly, because I know you want to see, that indeed there is on Blackboard the video that you need to make sure you watch because it sort of hits the highlights of the High Renaissance under number 17. It is the Art of the Western World, series number 4, the High Renaissance. So make sure you check that out. And also, for your study convenience, if you so desire, you can also go back into the Renaissance file folder and find, of course, the early Renaissance video that we watched the first half of, and the 2 videos that compose the lecture on the early Renaissance. So they are there for your study review, as well as under the old exam content folder, there is indeed exam number 3. So make sure that you look through all of that stuff in preparation for exam number 3. Okay? Okay. Now,
Palladio.
Palladio. Now, the main thing, though, about the High Renaissance was central planned churches influenced by Leonardo. So make sure you pay particular attention to that. People like Bramante in his redesign for the new St. Peter's and how heavily influenced he was by Leonardo. But also pay attention to Leonardo's artistic abilities as well as his inventiveness. Because in the High Renaissance, we're reaching a period where all of a sudden science is beginning to become almost as important as religion. And in the Baroque period, when we see more advances in science, we'll see that, maybe science is the new religion. More challenges to the church. But that's the other thing to understand about the period of the Renaissance. The church, they kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit. Now, you all know that in the period of the Renaissance, in the 16th century, the other things that were going on in Europe were things like this fellow named Martin Luther, who nailed his complaints to the church door in present-day Germany, and this fellow named Henry VIII in England, who said, Church of Rome, we don't need you. We make our own church, and guess who's going to be the head? Me. So there were a lot of complicated reasons behind both of those decisions by both of those people. And when we start the Baroque period after Christmas, now how many many of you all are going to be taking the next history?
Already done.
Still my heart.
I've already done it, so.
Well, for the people who will be here, we will be talking about this Baroque period. And a lot of what we see in Mannerism foreshadows the Baroque. In other words, Baroque architects and artists look back to these people who we call Mannerists, who were Renaissance artists, but they were doing something a little different. And that's why we call them Mannerists. They were doing it in their own manner. But getting back to the church, now you all know about sin, right?
Sin?
Sin.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
do know about
Yeah,
sin.
you know about sin. Well, okay. So, if you do some bad sinning, you know you go to hell, right? Based in Christian belief. But you know, even if you're good, you don't necessarily go right to heaven. You go to this sort of waylay place called purgatory. And purgatory was an idea that was pretty much created by the church in, you know, the 10th century. And there were lots of people in Europe who really couldn't quite deal with this idea of purgatory. Because, you know, purgatory, you can look in some prayer books in the Roman Catholic Church today, and they'll say, after this particular prayer, pray this prayer 50 times, and it will remove 1,000 years off of your time in purgatory. So it makes the average individual think 1,000 years. And that's not all of it. How long do I have to spend in purgatory? So, you know, the church, they were no dummies. During the Renaissance, they were commissioning all these artists to do all this beautiful painting and sculpture and design churches and palaces for them to live in and to pay for it somehow. So they started this practice of, well, you don't have to say those prayers anymore. Just write us a check and we'll give you an indulgence. We'll take some years off. And they came up with a great idea called the plenary indulgence, which if you got one of those, it removed all of your time from purgatory. What do you think that cost? A bunch. So as I say, with some of these basically corrupt ideas that were developing, there were people in other parts of Europe who were pretty upset with the church in Rome. As a matter of fact, in 1527, there was a Germanic king who got his horses and men together, and in 1527 they rode down to Rome, and they invaded and sacked Rome. And they whooped up on all those sissies that were having all those parties and living in those painted palaces and being so corrupt. They did it. It happened in the early part of the 16th century. But they left and things went on. But this thing began to happen in Europe, in France, in Germany, in England, called the Protestant Reformation. And it was with people like Martin Luther and Henry VIII and others that all of a sudden they broke away from the church. And they began to have their own Christian churches. And many, what we call Protestant churches today in America, trace their roots back to this period in history when they broke away from the church. Like the Lutherans, and the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians. So we're at that time frame when all of that was beginning to happen. So in the midst of it, still some great architecture was going on. And the next period, which is the Baroque period, which we start, you know, into the 17th century, was really spurred church in what they called the Counter-Reformation. And what happened there, the Pope got all of his bishops and his cardinals together, they had a bunch of meetings. And they planned how they were going to get all these people back into the church. And part of it was this huge outpouring of religious artwork and churches, the greatest in the history of humankind, this Baroque style. So I'm telling you this because I know all of you are going to be in here next semester, and I'm foreshadowing that Baroque with Mannerism. So, with that, we can begin to look at images. Gosh, last lecture.
Yeah, that's really hard, difficult.
It is. It makes me sad. What am I going to do every Tuesday and Thursday at 3:30? Gosh.
Be hard.
I'll be here. No, that's not what
Are you not teaching anything else than history? So I can take it.
Yeah, I'm teaching other things, but you're not in this program, so.
What is that supposed to mean?
Well, you're not. You're transferring to UK.
No, I'm gonna be here for you.
Oh, okay.
Like, do you teach any AutoCAD classes?
I teach classes that the students use AutoCAD.
Which is 105?
100 and 200.
Okay. But I need to take it first, 100, right?
Yes, you have to take 100 first. Yes.
Is it structure or something?
No, it's construction documents.
Cool. That's cool. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Mannerism, again, so named because Brunelleschi, the father of the Renaissance, had established such a clearly defined new style of architecture, using elements from the classical past, from Rome, from Greece, even from Romanesque and Byzantine. He had combined all these elements in a way that was very copyable, very light, very clear, very ordered, very rational. And so people were doing it. So this whole new style, this big movement of the Renaissance occurred. But then we get some of these other people, like this Michelangelo Buonarroti and this Andrea Palladio, who are the two. There were others, but the two I want to focus on. And they were doing Renaissance architecture. But there was something a little different. They were doing it in their own manner. And that manner consisted of these complicated stylistic changes that were peculiar to each one of them. And what I mean by that is, what Palladio was doing that was different was not exactly the same thing that Michelangelo was doing that was different, but they were kind of related in a way. Okay, so with Michelangelo, they like to say he was creating, oh yeah, he did Renaissance architecture, but there was this second architecture that was happening within his Renaissance architecture. So we want to try to establish today, what do they mean by that? What are some examples of this second architecture? So we're going to look at the Medici Chapel and the Laurentian Library and the Rosetta Stairway, and hopefully try to establish some of those things, as well as an urban planning project he did for the Capitoline Hill in Rome, which is the site of the old Roman Senate that overlooks the Roman Forum. And then, of course, Palladio. Palladio was a little bit later than Michelangelo, and Palladio is said to be the last of the humanist artists and architects. He was like the end of the road for the Renaissance. And he started out as a sculptor, but he was very heavily influenced by that fella Alberti that we talked about, the guy who wrote all the treatises on statuary and painting and architecture. And he even wrote 4 books on architecture, Quattro Libri, Del Architectura, 4 books of architecture. And he was also very famous. For those of you who watched the video, he's probably most famous for his villas
Oh, that's good.
that he designed. But he did do 1 or 2 churches, and we're going to look at one of them, the church in Venice, known as the Church of the Redemptori. He also did San Giorgio Maggiore there, but we're not going to look at that. But this Palladio guy, he designed these villas for these wealthy merchants who lived in Venice. And this area around Venice, known as the Veneto region, was where all these villas were built. There's this little body of water, a little stream that runs south from Venice to a place called Padua.
It's Palladio's villas on the canal, right? Next to
Yes,
I see.
exactly, exactly. Yes, they're on the Brenta Canal.
Mhm.
Exactly.
That's a good.
They're good. They're very, did you go to Padua?
Yeah.
Padua? Padua?
Mm-hmm.
Did you go to St. Anthony's?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what he's the patron saint of?
I didn't remember.
Forgetfulness
Same.
and lost things. So if you lose stuff, you should pray to St. Anthony.
Oh, yeah,
And he'll help you
We
find
should.
it.
I just remembered. Okay, okay. There,
All right.
there were people wishing something.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so Michelangelo and Palladio are our 2 featured architects from this period. Okay, so here we go back to the Medici family church, San Lorenzo. Remember, Brunelleschi did San Lorenzo. Here we have the church, cruciform shaped longitudinal plan church. And we looked at that church on the interior, and we saw how static things were, non-moving, everything very rationally placed. And we looked at this quadrangle, or this cloister, with the rounded arches around the courtyard. We saw the lightness and the clarity. So we saw in this spaces very clear examples of Brunelleschi's Renaissance style. But later on, Michelangelo comes along, and he designs this space right here, the Medici Chapel, which is where they buried all the heads of the Medici family. So the big guys were in here. And then he developed this number 4, which is a library, and this number 3, which is a stairway to the library. So this weird looking stair becomes very important in the transition of ideology from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Now, I guess, did any of you watch that video on the High Renaissance? Not even one? Nobody watched it?
Not yet.
I know, it was Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah. We had a lot
And you
of
couldn't
fun.
come to class on Tuesday because we were out on Wednesday. Okay, well, when you watch that video, there will be a segment about Michelangelo's statue of David. Now, you know the story about David from the Bible, right? He was the little guy, and there was this giant named Goliath. And David had this slingshot, and he managed to slay the giant Goliath. Okay, well, we'll use, because I know all of you are going to be here after Christmas, we're going to use the statue of David from Michelangelo to compare with the statues of David that were done by Baroque artists like Bernini. And what we're going to compare is what they refer to as the potential energy that is embedded within Michelangelo's sculpture. In other words, I mean, here's a guy who's looking up at a big old guy who's getting ready to kill him. And what would be going through your mind? It would be sort of like one of those childhood playground scuffs you may have gotten into, where you know you're getting into an argument or something's going to happen and somebody may be kicking your butt in a minute. And your adrenaline starts to rise. And you can feel the hair standing up on the back of your neck. You're not doing anything yet, but you're getting ready. And that's what's said to be happening in Michelangelo's sculpture of David. Not only is it a perfectly beautiful example of a human being, and that's the other thing Michelangelo was capable of doing. His sculpture was so incredibly human and lifelike that you would expect the people to walk around and be human. It was that real. Okay, so the potential of that energy, termed as having tension, and conflict. And Michelangelo was said to be a fairly temperamental individual on top of all that.
Oh, finally.
Oh, welcome. At least one person who will be here next semester.
No, he won't. Who's not gonna be here? You're not gonna be here? Wait,
Never mind. It's a long story. Okay, so what we want to try to do is we want to look at what Michelangelo was doing with the Medici Chapel and the stairway and the library that's different from what Brunelleschi was doing. Now, the first thing we're going to do is look at two images. One of Michelangelo's Medici Chapel and the other of Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapel, which he sort of copied a little bit. And what is different? So when we look at this image, even though it's a 3D cutaway section, and this is the 2D cutaway section, which I'm sure Brunelleschi would cry foul about since he rediscovered linear perspective. But what's one of the most obvious differences between the two?
Between them?
Yeah. What's one thing that you see in Michelangelo's Medici Chapel that you don't see in the Pazzi Chapel?
Sculpture?
Sculpture, very good. Yes, sculpture. And when you first look at that, it's like, well, so what? But in order to really put us back in that time frame and to really be able to understand the power of Michelangelo's sculpture and the realness of it, if you will, it's almost as if he's introducing a new level of virtual reality, where you've got these perfect sculptures of human beings that look so real that he's taking it to a new level. So that's one of the things that he does. And excuse me, throughout his architectural accomplishments, he uses sculpture as part of it. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing, it might be easier to start looking at what are similar features. They both have domes. They both have domes on pendentives. But all of a sudden, we got windows in Michelangelo's, and we have this intermittent level that doesn't really, it doesn't really show up in Brunelleschi's. It's, the pendentives are clearly part of that mid-level, but they're separate here as if to create a new level.
This
a clear
level is pointing actually.
Yeah, it's almost like these are clear story windows or something. So we see additional spaces, basically. But when we look at them, they look, at first glance, pretty similar. But then we look a little closer, and we see that in the areas between this gray-colored stone, it's not just relief moldings. It looks like a whole different set of architectural elements. And so these are the things that begin to make up what Trachtenberg is referring to as that second architecture. There's stuff added. There's more stuff going on. And it is beginning to set the stage for a more dynamic form of architecture and dynamic spaces. Not static, like the Renaissance. Okay, so there's the same thing. Here we have a nice interior view. And we can begin to see that, why yes, those lighter colored stone architectural elements do look like a whole other set of elements within the building. And the sculpture, look at the way the sculpture reclines. He's almost doing what the Greeks did in their pedimented temple tympaniums, where the figures begin to follow the form of the architectural elements and become so much a part of it and integrated into it. And then we look a little bit closer and we see, well, wait a minute. Look at the way this wall and this cornice breaks and recedes back and then pops back out. It's crowded, it's busy. It's beginning to suggest some sort of movement or explosion, if you will. But it's not really quite there yet. And we still see the white stucco walls and the dark gray stone and the patterns of the floor. So it's like, well, wait a minute, this guy is Renaissance, but there's some other things going on here that are very different. Now here we have two side-by-sides, and I guess this is when they were moving, but they're basically the same image, and you can just get a better view. And of course, these are the actual sarcophagi, you know, the tombs where those captains of the Medici dynasty would have been buried. So this was a very important spot for these people. And from this pigeon-eye view, we can see clearly how the cornices move around and break and recede. And so it's quite a bit different than what Brunelleschi was doing, even though in a subtle way. And then simply a view up into the dome. Now, what famous dome do you think Michelangelo was imitating in this dome?
The first
Pantheon?
Pantheon. Very good.
No?
Very good.
Yeah.
The Pantheon dome. Exactly.
The first, what was the first?
First one.
The first dome, right? Was it the first dome, really? Or all the American government should? It is the only surviving intact Roman building. This is the one.
Intact, yes. Okay, so now we move over to the library and the Rosetta Stair. And one of the things you'll notice is it's a linear space, of course, and it's divided with sacred over here, pagan and profane over here. And they basically created a cataloging system. Now, first of all, you have to understand that during this period, not everybody had books. Not everybody could read. And it was very special to be able to have books and to read. I mean, it was the body, the center of all knowledge. It was like the cloud, you know, where we store all that information that you pull up from the internet. So it was very rare and very, books would be very expensive. All handwritten, hand-bound, hand-copied. So this would have been a very expensive, very special collection of books.
design a library that was elevated in the building above any point where any previous floodwaters had ever hit from the Arno River. So that was a very important element of the design, elevating it. Plus, if you look along the perimeter, you can kind of see these indications of window openings. So it's a long, narrow space, but the windows provide the lighting because guess what? In the 16th century, they didn't have electric lighting. So if you were going to read, you preferred natural light. You could do candles, but what do candles do potentially to books? Burn them up. So that would be a bummer as well. So natural lighting, natural ventilation, and storage, as well as this sort of catalog system that breaks everything down into categories and places them where they belong. So this was a very new and revolutionary thing. Very orderly, very Renaissance. But when we look at this stairway, what does that look like? Look like anything to you guys? I mean, does it look like a bus? Does it look like an automobile? Does it look like a turtle? Or as somebody said in the other class, how about a centipede? Or maybe a scorpion? And when we think about centipedes or scorpions or lobsters or whatever, we tend to associate motion or movement with them. Unlike the static nature of the library itself. So here we're seeing a contrast. And look at that. There's that stairway. And that central portion. Does it remind you of anything? What do you think the inspiration was for that? Does it look like maybe Michelangelo? Huh?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Does it maybe look like Michelangelo was thinking about the first escalator? I mean, don't those steps look like they want to move? Or don't they look like a waterfall cascading down from the doorway to the library? Indeed they do. Very motion filled, and they split and they come down on both sides. But look at how little space is left in that room. The stairway fills it up. It becomes a sculpture in and of itself. And it's highlighted by the fact that this is like a 2.5-story room. So it's very small. I don't know the dimensions, but I seem to remember that I don't think it's 15 by 15, if I remember correctly. It's very small. And it's very tall. And the first time I ever got to go here, back in the 70s, they let you walk up these steps, which are made of wood, not stone. They're wooden stairs. They don't let you do that anymore. So, notice also from this view around the perimeter how, again, the cornice molding undulates, it breaks, the walls move back and forth. The architectural elements, the columns, the brackets, all seem to be crammed into the space, pushed and squeezed, again, alluding to that sense of tension and compression and this need for explosion, if you will. And here are two views, one looking up the center flight of stairs and the other looking at the corner of the room. And from the corner shot, you can see, you get a sense of how tall the space is. You can also see how the columns and the other architectural elements seem to be competing for the space. Just like at the doorway to the library, we have that pediment over the doorway. But it too is broken. See the vertical line there? It recesses back, and